It is March 2026. Just hours ago, satellite phones aboard oil tankers in the Persian Gulf began ringing with the same urgent message. Turn around. Do not attempt to transit. The strait is no longer safe. Captains who have sailed these waters for 20, 30 years, men who have navigated hurricanes, wars, and pirate-infested corridors, were gripping their radios with trembling hands and making the same call. Stop the engines. Drop anchor. Wait. But wait for what? Nobody could tell them, because what was unfolding beneath their hulls, what was silently spreading across the blue floor of the world's most important waterway, was something not seen in decades, something ancient, terrifyingly simple, and capable of bringing the global economy to its knees. We are talking about naval mines, small, cheap, almost laughably low-tech, compared to the hypersonic missiles and drone swarms dominating headlines. Yet in the hands of Iran, deployed at the precise choke point where 1/5 of the world's oil flows every day, these weapons have done something no missile could. They have trapped 1,750 ships, they have frozen the Persian Gulf, and they have sent oil prices surging past $100 a barrel for the first time in years, with whispers, official whispers from Tehran itself, that $200 could be next. This is not a drill. This is not a simulation. This is happening right now in March 2026, and it may be the most consequential maritime crisis of the modern era. If you think it doesn't affect you because you don't live near the Persian Gulf, stay with me. By the time this story ends, you'll understand exactly why the fuel in your car, the medicine in your hospital, the food in your grocery store, and the stability of nearly every economy on Earth are tied to what Iran just did in a body of water most people couldn't find on a map. To understand how this crisis exploded, you first have to understand the geography of one of the most strategically loaded stretches of ocean on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. Say that name out loud. Hormuz. It almost sounds mythological, like something from an ancient epic. And in a way, it is. The strait sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, a narrow corridor between Iran to the north and the Arabian Peninsula to the south. At its narrowest point, it is just 21 miles wide. 21 miles. You could drive that in under 20 minutes on a clear highway. Yet through those 21 miles flows roughly 17 to 21 million barrels of crude oil every single day. That's around 20% of the world's total oil supply. 1/5 passing through one tiny gap. Every ship carrying oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, Qatar, every single one must pass through that corridor. There is no alternate route, no back road, no bypass. Hormuz is the only door out. Iran has always known this. For decades, Iranian military planners have asked a single question: what would happen if that door closed? Their answer was stark: economic shock across the entire Western-aligned world. And now, in March 2026, after a chain of events so dramatic they still feel unreal, Iran has decided to find out. The story begins in late February 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran in an operation known as Epic Fury. The targets were military installations, nuclear facilities, missile depots, and leadership compounds. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East for nearly 4 decades, was killed. Iran's government plunged into chaos. Retaliation followed almost immediately. Missiles struck Israeli cities. U.S. military bases across the Gulf were attacked. And then, quietly, without dramatic footage of rockets lighting the night sky, Iranian naval units began doing something far more subtle and far more dangerous. They began mining the Strait of Hormuz. The weapon Iran chose was not futuristic. It was not classified technology or some experimental system reverse-engineered from captured drones. Naval mines are among the oldest weapons in modern warfare. The idea dates back to the American Civil War, when primitive explosive devices were used to defend harbors. During World War I, the North Sea was seeded with millions of them. In World War II, American aircraft mined Japanese ports in an operation called Operation Starvation, crippling Japan's wartime economy. And in 1988, in these same waters, an Iranian M08 mine, based on a design from the early 1900s, struck the USS Samuel B. Roberts and nearly sank it. Repairs cost $90 million. The mine itself cost roughly $1,500. That is the brutal math of mine warfare. The attacker spends almost nothing. The defender spends everything. Iran possesses between 2,000 and 6,000 mines in its arsenal, produced domestically and sourced from China and Russia. Yet they don't need to deploy them all. They don't even need to sink ships. All they need is the perception of danger. Because in the shipping world, perception is reality. The moment insurers like Lloyd's of London mark a shipping lane as a war risk zone, freight rates explode, captains refuse passage, companies reroute vessels, and the global supply chain begins to choke. That is exactly what happened. Within days of the mining operation beginning, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz fell by 70%, then 80%. Soon, for all practical purposes, it dropped to zero. Ships already inside the Gulf were trapped. Captains were ordered to anchor and wait. 138 container ships, carrying nearly 500,000 containers, were stuck west of the strait. 55 Chinese-flagged vessels alone were stranded. At least 6 major cruise ships, with roughly 15,000 passengers, found themselves floating inside an active war zone, their vacation itineraries replaced by emergency briefings and evacuation plans. Outside the strait, hundreds more ships sat waiting for clearance that never came. Counting every vessel trapped inside the Gulf, holding outside it, rerouted mid-journey, or refusing to depart altogether, the total climbed to roughly 1,750 ships, an armada of global commerce frozen in place by mines the size of refrigerators. Imagine looking down from space at the Persian Gulf. Normally, it resembles a busy highway, tankers flowing in steady lanes, full ships heading out, empty ones heading back. Now imagine that highway suddenly stopped, every vehicle parked, engines idling. Only the occasional military vessel moving quickly, scanning for mines. That is what satellite imagery showed in the first week of March 2026, the largest standstill in the history of ocean shipping. What made it even more alarming was how few mines had actually been used. Analysts believe Iran deployed only a few dozen, perhaps 100 at most, out of a stockpile potentially reaching 6,000. In other words, Iran still held nearly 90% of its mining capacity in reserve. The message was unmistakable. This could get far worse, and the economic shock came quickly. Brent crude surged above $100 per barrel within days, a jump of more than 38%. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in modern oil market history. 15 million barrels of crude oil and another 5 million barrels of petroleum products were suddenly stranded in the Gulf every single day. Asian refineries began drawing down emergency reserves. Fuel prices from Seoul to Stuttgart climbed sharply. Meanwhile, an Iranian military spokesperson appeared before cameras and delivered a blunt message. Prepare for oil at $200 a barrel. The price of oil, he said calmly, depends on regional security. Security you have destabilized. The ripple effects quickly reached everyday life across the globe. In Pakistan, the government shortened the work week to conserve fuel. In India, restaurants and hotels temporarily shut down to preserve energy supplies. In Thailand, government workers were instructed to take stairs instead of elevators to cut electricity usage. These weren't dramatic wartime sacrifices. They were quiet adaptations to a crisis triggered by a handful of metal spheres placed in a narrow channel thousands of miles away. A Thai bureaucrat climbing 6 flights of stairs because Iran mined the Persian Gulf. That is globalization's chain reaction. The United States responded with force. Over the first 10 days of the conflict, American aircraft and naval units sank roughly 50 Iranian vessels and destroyed 16 mine-laying craft near the strait. Plans were drafted to escort commercial tankers through the corridor. echoing convoy operations conducted during the Iran-Iraq tanker war of the 1980s. But the battlefield today is far more complex. Iran has spent decades building what strategists call an anti-access system across the Gulf, an overlapping network of missiles, mines, drones, submarines, and fast attack boats. At the center of it is what Iranian commanders call the Mosquito Fleet. Between 250 and 300 fast attack craft now operate across the Gulf. Individually small, but incredibly fast, they carry precision anti-ship missiles and can swarm larger targets. Missiles like the Nasser and Kosar can strike targets within 25 kilometers. Longer-range systems extend to 200 or even 300 kilometers, while newer weapons reportedly exceed 1,000 kilometers. Together, these systems create a dense web of threats that makes operating in the Gulf genuinely dangerous for any vessel Iran decides to target. By mid-March 2026, at least 19 commercial ships had been damaged in the conflict. 16 separate attacks were recorded in a single week by maritime security monitors. Ships connected to countries supporting the United States or Israel were targeted most frequently, while neutral or sympathetic vessels were often left alone. The world's most important shipping lane had effectively become a geopolitical sorting machine, and yet even during the crisis, Iranian oil continued to move. Tankers carrying Iranian crude were allowed through carefully managed corridors, while Western-linked ships remained trapped. The strait was not simply closed, it was selectively controlled. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session and condemned Iran's actions as a threat to international peace. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, responded bluntly, "The strait would remain closed for as long as Iran decided it should remain closed." He knew the leverage he held. For decades, Iran's military strategy has centered on asymmetric warfare, neutralizing stronger adversaries by targeting their vulnerabilities. The U.S. Navy may dominate open ocean combat, but mine warfare, swarm tactics, and economic disruption operate on a different battlefield. The real target is not American warships. It is the global economy's dependence on Gulf oil. Strategists call this concept sea denial. You do not need to control the sea. You only need to make it unusable for your opponent. After 30 years of preparation, Iran had achieved exactly that. Strategic petroleum reserves in the United States, Europe, and other industrial nations were released in the largest coordinated emergency drawdown in history. But those reserves are finite. Even the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve holds only about 700 million barrels, less than 6 weeks of combined exports from the Gulf at normal levels. Meanwhile, clearing mines is slow and dangerous work. Specialized ships, sonar teams, divers, and remotely operated vehicles must locate and neutralize each device individually. And in a contested environment, new mines can be laid faster than old ones are removed. There is a scenario quietly discussed among security officials in which the Strait of Hormuz does not reopen quickly, where the mine threat lingers for months rather than weeks. In that world, global shipping would need to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to tanker journeys and dramatically raising costs. Some Gulf countries have pipelines that bypass the strait, but their combined capacity cannot replace Hormuz. The world simply has no real alternative to that narrow corridor, and that is the core truth revealed by the crisis of March 2026. For decades, the global economy built an interconnected system of energy, shipping, and supply chains, and routed 1/5 of its oil through a channel only 21 miles wide. Now someone has placed a lock on that channel, and the entire world is discovering what happens next.